to talk about the global mega trends that will impact India's place in the world in the year 2020. We are joined now at the World Economic Forum in Davos by one of the world's leading public intellectuals and thinkers, Fareed Zakaria. Fareed, welcome to India today. It's fabulous to have you with us. We've just started a new year, and as one of the world's leading thinkers, I want you to explain to our audience what you think are the key global mega trends that you're looking out for most closely, that you believe will impact India's place in the world this year.
Well, the most important one, I think, was evident at this Davos. This is, I think, my 24th Davos. Most years that I've come here, it's all about openness. It's all about opening up markets, opening up technology, widening access, encouraging the flow of ideas, people, goods all over the world. And of course, it is that opening that allowed India to rise after the reforms of the early 90s. This Davos, you had the President of the United States explaining how he wanted managed trade, limited immigration, controls on technology, and it was in a sense part of a larger atmosphere. That China, after all, walls off its technology, practices a certain amount of limited free trade. And so we've gone from a very different, a mood of openness to a mood of, I wouldn't say all being closed, but managed and limits. Now, if that's the case, that's a very different international economy and global system for India. Unfortunately, Prime Minister Modi has adapted to it very well. 2 years ago, Modi came to Davos, and if you watch his speech, it was basically a critique of Donald Trump. It was saying too many nations are turning inward, globalization is shrinking, in fact, we need more trade, more openness. Since then, of course, India has become the world champion of protectionism. The US Trade Department pointed out that India now has the highest tariff barriers of any country in the world. So it feels to me this is a very dangerous path for India to be on. Look, the United States can flirt with protectionism. China can flirt with protectionism because they're actually much more open than the Indian economy is. India needs openness, it needs foreign investment, it needs the competition to be able to really be world class. And if India starts closing itself off in a world that's closing itself off, it's not good for India.
Here at the World Economic Forum, Fareed, you've had an opportunity to speak to world leaders, thinkers from across the world. How do you see them perceive India, and what's changing between earlier and now?
Disappointment. I would say the biggest, particularly with US elites. Look, Americans want to like India. They want to like India because they like the idea of India. An open, liberal, secular democracy compared with China, but even on its own terms. Plus, the influence of Indian Americans and in the Indian American community should not be underestimated. But there have been two blows. First, India has disappointed on the growth and openness story economically. A lot of people made investments in India. You know, in some cases it worked out, but by and large there was a feeling that India was going to be the next China. It hasn't quite worked out that way. And the second and much more disturbing one, of course, has been over the last few years a sense that India is turning away from its secular and even democratic credentials with regard to some areas, you know, like freedom of the press, independence of the judiciary, treatment of minorities. So it's causing a lot of anxiety, actually, because, again, Americans want to like India. American elites want to align with India. America wants to strategically find itself in partnership with India. But Americans, you know, the closest alliances for America are alliances not just of interests, but of values. So you'll find that, you know, Britain is, and Western Europe is the obvious one, Japan, even Israel. The shallowest alliances are when you're making an alliance just for the strategic benefit, US, Saudi Arabia. India has the potential to have a deep relationship with America. And I think there is a sense of disappointment in the last 2 or 3 years.
But a lot of what you're saying is happening in India could well be said about the United States as well. So is it just disappointment with India, or is it part of a larger global phenomena where some of the factors you speak about are playing themselves out in country after country? Why do you think that's happening? Is that a permanent trend? Is that likely to stay? What do you make of the rise of the strongman as this all-powerful, very popular leader?
And it's a great point. I think what Americans would probably say, and I think with some accuracy, is US is in a different league than India. If you look at the press and how it reports on Donald Trump, I think you will not find the Indian press reporting on Narendra Modi in that way. I think the institutions have held up, courts, even things like the FBI, the CIA. I mean, Trump is half the time fighting with his own government because the government is trying to maintain integrity and independence. But you're 100% right on your larger point. This is another big global trend. Look, if you look around the world right now, who are the people who are thriving? Putin, Xi, Erdogan, Modi, Trump. These are people who are nationalists and populists. In other words, they've figured out a way to appeal to the mass, a certain mass population, but also present themselves as people who say it's a big bad world out there. I know how to take care of the nation. Don't trust in these global forces, global institutions, international trade. No one's going to look out for you and for our country. I am. It's a compelling message because I think people feel we are living in an age of anxiety. Because even though there's an enormous amount of progress, there's a lot of churn, there's a lot of change. You know, think about, I chaired a panel on gender equality. Think about how much has changed in terms of gender equality in the last 30 years compared to the last 3,000 years. You know, men have been on top for so long, and this is now being transformed. Think of the rights of gays and lesbians. Think of the rights of minorities in general. So all this churn produces a lot of anxiety. And if some guy comes and says, I'm going to restore order, it's very compelling. It's compelling in India, where and it's always a mythical past. It never really existed, that you're always being promised. Putin is returning Russia to some God knows what glory. Trump says, make America great again, some nostalgic vision of the 1950s. Modi is doing the same. So it's compelling, and for now, this is clearly the trend. The danger, I think, for a place like India is the democratic institutions are not quite as strong as in the West. I mean, I always thought, for example, the Indian courts and the Indian media would be unbreakable. I think, look, the Prime Minister and the BJP have been able to intimidate a lot of the media. Not all of it, thank God. They've been able to do stuff on courts that I didn't think was possible. India has to watch out because Turkey is the role model for India. At this point, it would be difficult to really call Turkey a democracy. And I would hate to be in a situation 10 years from now where you were looking at India and saying the same thing.
We're seeing some kind of a fight back from the streets. We've seen students going out and protest. What are you following that very closely? What are you making of the anti-CAA protest that we've seen? A lot of it in the Muslim community, women out in places like Shaheen Bagh, and also in schools, universities, colleges and campuses across the country.
Look, protests are important. They've been an incredibly reassuring sense of India's civic culture, democratic culture. After all, don't forget, Indian independence begins with non-violent protests, from the Indian National Congress. By itself, it's not enough. You need organization. You need an opposition party or coalition, and you need alternative leadership. And those are the things that I think we have to look at. The best thing I have to say about India in retrospect, thinking about how the country is put together, is that the states have retained a lot of autonomy. They've retained their own political culture. And so that, I think, is going to... The reason I'm optimistic about India is I think that at the state level, you are going to see a pushback. You're going to see, a kind of... The checks and balances of the American system don't quite exist at the central level in India, but they exist at the state level. And they have always broken this kind of quest for absolute power in India. If you think about in the 60s, what broke the hold of Congress first was the South over linguistic issues. It might happen again. The BJP has almost no representation from the South. And so if that becomes a form of the check, maybe that's good. But it's important that it then be translated into a programmatic oppositional response that is pro-democratic. You don't want the next group to come in and say, now we get to pack the courts with our judges. Now we get to intimidate the media and withhold advertising, so they'll be favorable to us. That isn't the right answer. So that's why I say leadership is very important. A culture of democracy, a culture of openness has to be at the heart of this opposition.
You said American elites are disappointed, but that doesn't seem to be impacting relations between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi. We had Prime Minister Modi at the Howdy Modi event with Donald Trump walking around, and that was quite something. Donald Trump later saying he hadn't seen something like that. Now we're hearing that Donald Trump will be coming to India next month. So what are you making of the American president's visit to India? How do you think that's likely to go? And the fact that Prime Minister Modi, according to the latest India Today Mood of the Nation poll, still remains hugely popular. We just put that poll out this week. His party would still get very close to a majority.
Yeah. Look, at a strategic level, as I've always said to you, Rahul, we've talked about this before. US wants India as a partner, as an ally. India has been the reluctant bride. I mean, the Bush administration handed India everything it had asked for in the nuclear deal, and the Indians were suspicious, even this, despite that. So the relationship has always been one where India has still not figured out whether it is completely comfortable being in the US orbit. Modi, I think, is more willing, but BJP has its own concerns about foreign domination in industry, economy, culture, in all those areas. So that remains. I think politically, Modi and Trump are natural allies for the reasons we've been talking about. They're both strongmen, they're both populists, they both also see this long-term relationship. So I do hope that India and America can develop a relationship that is long-term and not based on personalities or parties, but based on the enduring realities of this shared culture, these shared values, and the reality of a geostrategic climate in which China has been rising, and there is a need for some structure to contain that rise. So I think it'll all be fine, but I don't think it changes the fact that you don't have, at that broader societal level, societal elites, business elites, intellectual elites are somewhat disappointed with India.
How do you see the American election this year? The process of impeaching Donald Trump is underway. Do you see him being impeached, or do you think that's out of the question? Do you see Donald Trump being re-elected for it?
So it seems to me totally out of the question that he would actually be convicted. So clearly what's going to happen is the Senate will acquit. The question becomes, what is the political impact of that acquittal on the 2020 election? That's the one X factor that we don't actually know. Everybody's making their own guesses. The thing I would say is, if Trump was so confident it would help him, he wouldn't be sending out 125 tweets every day saying how terrible it is that he's being impeached and how terrible it is that the trial is happening. Look, it's a stigma. This is the third president in history to be impeached. Even his supporters acknowledge that what he did was wrong. They just say it's not impeachable, and it's, maybe it's not technically a crime, and therefore should something that is not technically a crime be impeachable? At the end of the day, it was a bad thing. It was clearly an abuse of office for personal gain, and I don't quite see how it helps him. His base is with him. They love him. The problem is his base can't elect him. So he needs a little bit more. America is almost like a 44-44 country, and you're battling over the 2% that's shifting. So I tend to think it actually has hurt him. Look, he has two great things going for him. He has a great economy, and he's the incumbent president. Normally it should be a cakewalk. I mean, that's what's elected almost every president in the past for re-election. He has a 55% disapproval rating. If you look in states where Republicans normally win, they are in trouble. So it's going to be very close. I'm not going to pretend to you, I can tell you, but it's closer than you. If somebody told you the US has the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years and the president is struggling to get re-elected, no one would have believed it.
We were standing right here with the editor of the Washington Post having a similar conversation, and he said, while the polling data suggests that Trump is struggling, you speak to anyone and they're convinced that he'll win again. What's your gut telling you? Is Donald Trump coming back for a second term as president?
My gut is telling me it's going to be very hard to beat him. Part of it is, I think we've entered an age of celebrity politics. He's become this mega star, and he knows how to always keep the focus on him. Even if you're impeaching him, you're talking about him. Even if you're criticizing him, you're talking about him. And the Democrat is going to be, in comparison, a midget compared to the most famous man in the world who everybody talks about. In that sense, at least Hillary Clinton was a global figure. I mean, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, even Biden, they're just not quite at the same level. And I worry that some of what politics now has just become is a celebrity game. Look, the same is true for Modi. You know, that ability to make yourself this kind of, we're in an age of superhero movies. Maybe we're also in an age of superhero politics, where the key is to pump yourself up into this kind of larger-than-life figure, and then you're just towering over everyone else.
So you've spoken of the superhero incumbent. I'm very curious to know from you what you believe is the counter to that, because we saw, even in the United Kingdom, the opposition completely decimated by Boris Johnson. In the United States, the Democrat candidates face a similar challenge where who is it who can take on Donald Trump? And in India, the India Today Mood of the Nation poll says that Prime Minister Modi has 53% popularity rating. Rahul Gandhi comes in 43% lower at 10.
Yeah.
There's a difference of 40% between Rahul Gandhi and Narendra Modi, and it seems to be a global phenomenon. So what's the political counter to that in your view?
The political counter is you have to find somebody who has mass appeal, who's not a demagogue. It's not impossible. I mean, Churchill, Roosevelt, people like that were like that. Thatcher, Reagan. But I think the mistake is to imagine you can beat that with somebody who is very quiet, and that. I think that idea that people want a return to normalcy, I wish that were true. Look, in my ideal of a liberal democracy, people wouldn't care so much about who the president was. They'd care more about the institutions. I remember the conservative commentator William Buckley used to say that his favorite country in the world was Switzerland, where we are right now, because you ask an average educated person on the street, who is your president, and they wouldn't know. Because Switzerland, there's a rotating presidency. The point is, government shouldn't be put on that pedestal. But we're not in that age. So you have to fight fire with fire. You have to find somebody who's charismatic, who, that's why Obama worked. Obama had his own form of charisma. So I don't think you can do it without that. Now, who that is on the Democratic side, the one thing I'll say is the Democrats have tended to win when they elect a charismatic outsider who kind of the country falls in love with. John F. Kennedy, even Jimmy Carter, who was a one-term governor from Georgia, nobody had heard of him, sweeps in after Watergate. Clinton, young, post-World War II generation. Obama, of course, first black president. When it elects the party elder who has waited his turn and bided his time, those people don't win. John Kerry, Al Gore, Walter Mondale, Hillary Clinton, and Joe Biden. Joe Biden fits into that category. I like Joe Biden. He's a nice guy. But if you look, Democrats need to fall in love. Republicans fall in line. Whoever the Republican nominee is, they will vote for. Trump ran against 16 Republicans who said, if this guy gets the nomination, our party is finished. 2 months later, they all endorsed him. He got 98% of the Republican vote. That doesn't happen on the Democratic side.
The problem for the Democrats at this time seems to be there's no one to fall in love with.
Precisely. This is their challenge is, they need somebody they can get very excited about. That's what brings out the young voters. That's what brings out minorities. You can't just tell them, they come because the Republicans come out because they're scared these guys are going to take over the country, and then they'll make it into some multicultural hell or whatever it is. So we have to stop it. The Democrats need to be inspired.
And there's no one to fall in love with in India either in the opposition. How are you seeing that? Is there anyone you see as a potential hope for the future? What are you making of Rahul Gandhi's struggle, sometimes in, sometimes out? He gave up being Congress president. Now there's a lot of talk in the Congress of him coming back as president once again.
Yes, the Congress party cannot give up its fixation with the Gandhi family. Look, I think that, again, the hope in India is the states. India does not need quite the same thing, because you almost have a state-by-state election. So there can be local charismatic leaders, and then they come together as a coalition and put out. Let's not forget, two of the best governments India has had were the Narasimha Rao and the Deva Gowda government, actually. They were reformists, they were relatively clean, they moved the country forward. Would it be so bad to have another coalition government where you have another person, the prime minister, who doesn't think he's the emperor, who doesn't think he's the sun king of India, and you move the country forward? But in their states, they would each need to be able to have that. And look, if you look at what happened in Maharashtra, you look at what's happening. India, that's why I say I'm hopeful, because there is still at the state level real contestation of power, alternation of power. But I don't see anybody at a national level who can rival Modi. But Modi was a nobody 2 or 3 years before he became one. So it's not impossible. I mean, the good news here is barriers to entry are very low. Anyone can come up. If you can capture the imagination of the country, you can capture the imagination.
One of the mega trends that's impacting the world at this moment is the increasing rift between China and the United States in the battle for who will dominate and run the 21st century. Who do you think, Fareed, will ultimately win this battle between China and the US?
Look, the biggest mistake people have made over the 20th century is to underestimate the United States. If you think about it, in the 20s and 30s, the fascists underestimated America. In the 50s and 60s, the communists underestimated America. And after the Cold War, lots of people said, oh, it's going to be Japan's century. US has incredible staying power because it is very, very broad, vital, dynamic, vibrant. The forces that keep it so, I think, are basically still intact. As long as we keep immigration and openness going, which even though Trump is trying to tinker at, it's more at the margins. But China is a very substantial, it's the first true peer competitor the US has had, because the Soviet Union was never really an economic or technological peer. So you have a real competition for the first time, and two very different systems. The biggest area it's going to come out on is technology, not trade. Trade, there'll be a way to manage it, to come up with these kind of trade deals. It's not great for global trade because it's all bilateral. But technology, we are entering a bipolar world of technology. There is going to be an American/Western ecosystem. There is going to be a Chinese ecosystem. And for India, the fundamental choice will be, which way do you go? Every country is going to try to do it a la carte. Every country is going to say, in Asia particularly, a lot of countries are going to say, we want to be with China economically, but we want to be with America politically, diplomatically. But they won't be given that choice. The choice will be, do you go with America, but then you have to go with America politically, economically, strategically, or do you go with China? Mixing and matching is going to be more difficult. But it's going to be very complicated. Look, I can tell you the Germans are not sure they're going to ban Huawei. The British are not sure they're going to ban Huawei. So if your closest allies are not, the US has asked 63 countries to ban Huawei, I think, or 63 or 61. Under 5 have said yes. Most of them are still waiting. They're still trying to see, can we play both sides?
While this is a complication even for countries like Germany and the United Kingdom, you've got China sitting virtually on India's shoulder. So how do you see China and United States competition impacting India? Because you've got in our country Prime Minister Modi saying the 21st century will be India's century, whereas if you look technologically, financially, economically, we're not in the same league yet.
Yeah, I mean, the Indians have to stop boasting about a future that has not happened. I remember Kamalnath coming to Davos and saying, oh, China will grow old before it grows rich. We're going to overtake them. At that point, China was 2.5 times the size of the Indian economy. Today, it's 5 times the size of the Indian economy. We need to talk less and reform more. So that's the fundamental point. In a bipolar world I'm describing of technology, I think India will have no choice but to choose the US. I think it'll be very difficult, because if India chooses China, the US will, it will have very substantial security repercussions in terms of sharing of intelligence, defense cooperation, things like that. So India will then be choosing does it want to become a subsidiary state of China's ecosystem, or does it want to have some independence? India's too big, I think, to be subsidiary to China.
There was a big Huawei pavilion here in the promenade at Davos, but there isn't a comparable American company. Yeah. There was a conversation around technology, telecom technology. The general sense of the experts here, the World Economic Forum, was that the United States is at least about 5 to 10 years behind Huawei when it comes to 5G technology. So you're saying pick the US, but there's nothing really in the United States to pick. Whatever advances there are in 5G actually with European companies. You're
asking very good questions. It's a real problem. What I mean, that's why I said American/Western. There is basically a combination of Ericsson, Nokia, and Cisco that is a plausible alternative to Huawei. Huawei is, you're right, somewhat ahead, and more importantly, it's cheaper. So you're being told, don't take the better, cheaper technology. But I'll point out to you, there's one very, very smart guy in India who understands these trends very well, I think. Mukesh Ambani's Jio system has not a single Chinese component. That tells you something. He's thinking about the future. Why is it that Jio is completely 100% China-free? Because I think he knows that there's going to be a choice in the future at some point.
And you think it's better for India to stay with the United States and not pick a cheaper technology, because your way has gone to the extent of saying they'll invest in India, they're willing even to transfer technology to companies abroad, and if India negotiates hard enough, maybe to India as well. That's a big temptation, to get 5G technology without making the effort and to get it very easily because of the size of the Indian market.
So, as I said, my preference would be we don't go down this route. I think that this is a route that fractures the world, that creates a divided globalization, that is going to mean lower growth, less technological innovation, less trade. I don't like the idea of this bipolar world. I think that there's a way for the US and China to compete economically, but still to maintain an open ecosystem. It means the US has to give some, but the Chinese also have to give. At the end of the day, Chinese companies do have a subsidiary relationship to the Chinese government that has to be talked about. But what I'm saying is, if you are forced to choose, I think, look, there's downsides to both strategies. I can't see India going down a strategy where it becomes a economic subsidiary of a greater Chinese empire.
How do you see the relationship between India and China play out? Ever since the Doklam crisis, things have been reasonably calm. We've had the Chinese president come over, the Indian Prime Minister is going once again in the spirit of what was agreed upon in Wuhan. There hasn't been any major prick which festers into a wound. Do you think that's the way it can stay contained, or do you believe some kind of friction and eruption is only inevitable?
China has, since 1962, wanted to make clear that they are happy to have good relations with India as long as India understands the hierarchy of that relationship. That China can invade India, China can choke India, and that therefore there are certain red lines. I think that that's fundamentally not a good long-term strategic place for India to be in. So if India is willing to accept that somewhat subsidiary status, the Chinese will be more than happy. That is the essence of Chinese foreign policy. It's not imperial domination in the classical Western sense. The Chinese have always wanted to be respected as the center of the system. You come, you pay obeisance, you kowtow, you give gifts, but they don't want to take over your territory, things like that. But they want it to be very clear what the hierarchy is. So as long as India is willing to play that game, I think, it's possible to have very good relations with China. But my gut is India, both in terms of just its size, its geography, its democratic culture, it's going to be hard to play that game. India would be better off being an independent pole with a strong relationship with the West, as a counter to China, not in a confrontational military sense, but in a sense where China too has to respect certain boundaries and certain red lines that are important to India.
Mm-hmm. You've written of deglobalization. Kumaramanglam Birla recently writes of slowbalization, the era of slowbalization. How do you think a country like India, given where we are in the income pyramid, should be pushing its growth numbers at a time when global exports, one of the key pillars of growth, are slowing down, and is that much tougher for a country like India to grow, unlike what China was able to achieve over the last 3 decades?
So first of all, it's a good reminder that when you have a chance, take it. India squandered the opportunity of 3 decades of openness. To be fair, didn't squander it. In the 1990s, it took a real advantage of it, but in the last 10 years, I would say, it has squandered an opportunity where there was still a great era of progress and openness. But if you are committed to it, there's enough globalization going on for India to benefit. If you look at countries like Greece, Ukraine, Brazil, they are busy reforming. They are busy, and the truth is, in an age of slower growth, in an age where it's harder to find stars, if you're one of the countries that are truly reforming and opening up, you may benefit more. If you came to Davos 10 years ago and you said, my economy is doing well, my finance minister is brilliant, we've done these reforms, they would say, take a ticket and stand in line. There are 25 countries like that. In the next 10 years, maybe there will be only 5 countries like that. And if India is one of those 5, it will be by far the largest. Look, India has an extraordinary opportunity. because it is the largest developing market in the world that still has potential because of its low base. You know, I mean, India is what? It's under $2,500 GDP. China is close to 10,000, even more now, right? So there is a great opportunity for growth, but people, as I say, have been disappointed enough that there have to be genuine efforts. And the government, you know, it's not just the government, the Reserve Bank, you get the feeling in India that the people in charge just don't get markets, capitalism, investment. They're 2 steps forward, 4 steps back.
You spoke of the world looking out for key reforms from India. What are the reforms you believe global investors would like to see to help India move its growth story?
Look, it's pretty obvious what India needs to do. The problem is to have the political courage to do it. The financial system is a total mess. You look at this, look at what the markets are telling you. You have these state-owned banks that have 75% of the savings of the Indian people. And you have one private bank, HDFC Bank, which has a larger market cap than all of those state banks put together. That's telling you that people think the whole state banking sector is utterly inefficient. It is wasting the government's money, it's wasting people's money. People need to understand when the government wastes money, this is taxpayer money. It is all being squandered on this massively inefficient financial system. You have way too many state-owned companies in India, and they've waited so long, they're basically going to have to give them away. The Air India story is the perfect example. 25 years ago, you could have properly privatized it. At this point, if there's a fire sale, they'll be lucky. If there are people who are willing to pick up the pieces of debris, they'll be lucky. There are hundreds of companies like that you could do. They need the money. You've got to stop these subsidies that are not, inefficient. So there's so many areas where there are opportunities for it. GST was meant to be a simplification. What do you still have 7 levels of, it's maybe down to 5 now. It needs to come down to 1 or 2 at the most. It's the most complicated sales tax in the world right now. So there's so many cases where what needs to be done is obvious. The question is, do you have the political will to actually do it?
In the last part of the interview, I want to ask you about Kashmir and what's your sense of what's happening in Jammu and Kashmir and the government's decision to scrap Article 370, which has led to some problems in Kashmir. But by and large, would you say the government's been able to contain the situation better than most would have expected?
Yes, I think that they have been able to contain the situation better than most have expected. Look, the situation in Kashmir is a total tragedy because the way India has handled it under Congress and non-Congress governments has not been good. For a democracy to have a part of the country that is essentially under almost continuous martial law with an almost continuous suspension of democracy and democratic rights is a terrible situation. On the other hand, when you have a Pakistan that has been fueling militancy and insurgency and violence and terrorism for decades and decades, it is an understandable reaction. I don't want to, I really do think it's important to remember it's not a good place we are. But I think many countries, many democracies, and that facing a similar situation might react in a similar way or somewhat similar way. So I think that there has to be a broader solution to Kashmir. It has to involve somehow getting the Pakistani government to realize that there is no future in constantly, trying to keep India off guard, strategic depth, whatever you want to call it, this, asymmetrical warfare. That if you could do that, and if you could simultaneously make the promise that Kashmir would be given back its democratic rights, that's a kind of win-win that theoretically makes sense. Unfortunately, it seems we're very far from that right now.
Imran Khan was here at the World Economic Forum saying all kinds of nasty things about India, not in the plenary hall, but when he spoke at the IMC lunch. How much of a global risk is the relationship between India and Pakistan at this moment, given what happened post the terror attack in India and the Balakot airstrikes? How does the world perceive the relationship between India and Pakistan at this moment?
No, I think it's fundamentally stable. Look, my view has always been, in the Indian and Pakistani case, by and large, nuclear deterrence works. If you put it very simply, when India and Pakistan went independent, they fought a war roughly every 10 years until they got nuclear weapons, and they've never fought a war since then. It shows you that when the stakes get high, people get cautious. Unfortunately, what it's meant is that Pakistan in particular has used these non-direct military tactics. the jihadis, the militants, things like that. India then, as a result, clamps down more and more on Kashmir. That's this ugly dynamic, but it's essentially a bilateral dynamic. It has almost no spillover. And I don't see any particular spillover. The Chinese are helping the Pakistanis, of course, but basically it's a bilateral tragedy, not an international tragedy.
In conclusion, when you look at the world in 2020, what's the biggest risk according to you? Do you believe where things are in Iran would possibly be the biggest risk, and the uncertainty of what could happen depending on which event unfolds in Iran next?
So I'd say geopolitically, you're absolutely right, because Iran and the US are on a kind of collision course with no exit ramp. If they find an exit ramp, we'll all breathe a sigh of relief. But right now, the pressure on Iran is tightening. Sanctions, the economy shrank 10% last year. It'll probably shrink 15% this year. Those are kind of World War II levels of contraction for an economy to go through. The Soviet economy contracted, the Russian economy in the 90s contracted about 35%. So this is huge body blow to the Iranian economy. They don't have a lot of options, so they're cornered. They could lash out in various ways, and then the US will react. Right? So that's, to me, the biggest geopolitical danger. The biggest geoeconomic danger, it seems to me, is we have gone through a remarkably benign 8 or 9 years, right? I mean, US has done fantastically. US markets have tripled in size. Last year, 62 central banks, I think, lowered interest rates or eased money. After 2020, after Trump and the Democrat election, whatever happens, I have a feeling we will enter a new world economically. It will be a world of slower growth, but when that happens, sometimes it doesn't happen, slowly, incrementally, in a planned way. There could be some kind of a shock to the system. Whenever things look so smooth, you always have to remind yourself, about every 10 years, there is usually some economic blow-up, crisis, major recession. We're due for one.
This has been just such a fascinating conversation. You've given everyone so much to think about. Fareed Zakaria, thank you for living up to billing of being one of the greatest thinkers. It's been a very, very interesting conversation. Wish you all the best. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Rahul. Thanks.
Thank you.